I'm Spencer Bailey. This is Time Sensitive. Hey everyone, today marks the 111th episode and 5-year anniversary of Time Sensitive, and to mark the occasion, we've got a very special guest, and at age 97, the oldest guest we've ever had on the show, the Pittsburgh-based artist and sculptor Thaddeus Mosley. Thad may well be, or at least in my mind is, the closest living artist to Constantin Brâncuși and Isamu Noguchi. In any case, his work certainly extends out from their abstract language and alchemical level of craft, but primarily through one medium, wood. Through a single-mindedness and a certain modesty, Thad has slowly, quietly, and methodically built his life as an artist. Never intending or seeking a full-time, quote, art career, he worked for the U.S. Postal Service for 4 decades, was married twice, and raised 6 children, all while carving out time to make his sculptures. It's only in more recent decades, and especially in the last decade, that his work has gotten the international recognition and attention it has so long deserved. For Thad, his art making has always been a means of surrounding himself with sculpture. I'll never forget 3 years ago when I saw work of his at the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh, and it quite literally stopped me in my tracks. It practically spoke to me, the way a truly great work of art sometimes can. There's something about his sculptures that makes them seem animate or alive. In his hands, wood sings. There's also something jazz-like to his sculptures, and some writers and critics, rightly I think, have noted that his work is jazz. As you'll hear, when it comes to time, Thad has so much wisdom to share. Remarkably, he's been carving sculptures since his late 20s, more or less for 70 years straight, and his enduring dedication to his craft is practically unparalleled. On the episode, among many things, we talk about his early years as a sportswriter for a local newspaper in Pittsburgh, his enduring affinity for the work of Brâncuși and Noguchi, and the rhythmic language that poetry, music, and sculptures all share. Before we get into the episode, I'd first like to thank our Season 9 presenting sponsor, L'École School of Jewelry Arts, which is supported by the Maison Van Cleef and Arpels. With the mission of sharing the art and culture of jewelry with the general public, L'École's offerings range from classes on art history and introductory jewelry making to public lectures and talks, from books and exhibitions to a brand new podcast, Voice of Jewels. Since establishing its first campus in Paris in 2012 and a second in Hong Kong in 2019, L'École recently opened campuses in Shanghai and Dubai. Housed in the twin villas on Middle Huaihai Road and spread over nearly 22,000 square feet, the Shanghai School is the largest school of jewelry arts in the world. It offers free exhibitions as well as classes and in-person lectures by art historians, gemologists, jewelers, and craftspeople. The Shanghai campus's inaugural exhibition featured a collection of men's rings, while the Dubai campus opened with an exhibition unearthing the history and lore of the emerald. You can learn more about L'École and its current and upcoming offerings at www.lecolevancleefarpels.com. That's www.lecolevancleefarpels.com. And now, here's my conversation with Thaddeus. Hi, Thad. Welcome to Time Sensitive.
Thanks for inviting me. This looks like an intellectual oasis I'm in.
I thought we'd begin today on the subject of time through the lens of trees. And your friend, the late artist Sam Gilliam, wrote a 2020 poem in which he noted that Thad is the forest. So I wanted to ask, what are your thoughts on forest, trees, and wood when it comes to time or from a temporal perspective?
Well, I would imagine that trees were here long before any of us were. And, of course, my earliest memories, my father worked in the coal mines, number 5 mine near Grove City. And my earliest memories, maybe 3.5 or 4, playing around the house. And, of course, from our backyard was nothing but trees. And the country school I started in, right there on Route 208, it was a one-room schoolhouse, and in the back of the school was nothing but trees. So I grew up pretty much surrounded by trees. Of course, coming from Pennsylvania, has lots and lots of trees. But as you say, as an artist, my speculation has always been trees as material for art. And another thing, of course, when I'm looking at bare trees, particularly driving or someone riding me through the roads and stuff, I look at the bare trees and I see such beautiful shapes that you don't have to really carve them. The trees grow because of the climate or temperatures. They do all sorts of interesting shapes.
Right, and they grow so slowly that it's in the circles that we humans can actually see the time in which the tree is aged.
Well, that's true. Trees, I think particularly, use of them in parks. Of course, people nowadays are sort of really against plastics. And they're against cutting down trees, and of course they're also not in tune too much with concrete as an indoor building. But you have to make compromises somewhere, and of course trees are usually the foundation for most buildings, at least on an individual scale.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole mass timber architecture movement now. What are your views, literally or philosophically, on what you might call your carving time? The time that you spend making the sculptures, and I guess also extending out of that, how do you think about your sculptures as time?
I've been fortunate enough to live a fairly long time. I'll be 98 in July, which is not too far away. But actually, sculpture time for me probably never cease. Even if I'm in bed, I'm thinking about what I'm going to do tomorrow, or what went wrong, how I can correct this, or because what I make is not like working with ceramics. You just mix up the clay and decide which way you want it to go. But when you're dealing with trees, you're dealing with a circular form. You're dealing also with a form very organic and natural. There may be big knots in the middle. There may be wormholes. A lot of wood is cut down. Trees are cut down because they're damaged either through weather or through insects. So you have to deal with those things. Besides that, I'm thinking about a piece I'm working on now, and I'm thinking about, I've been sort of rounding out the insides, and so when people see that, they think the wood is very smooth, but the grain goes all different types of ways, and so you have to keep changing tools and to get the shape and whatnot you want. Over time, you learn how to deal with that, but the main thing is that the material pretty much decides how you're going to work and what you can do, unless you decide to cut into slabs and kiln dry it and laminate it and make something else. I'm thinking of the artists that laminate wood, and they make tables and stuff out of lamination, or even furniture. But people that work with raw forms such as, you have to really respect that you're working in this circle, and also you're working with organic material.
You mentioned your age, and I think we have to mention here, you've been making art since your late 20s, so 70 years practically. I was wondering if there's anything you could share about what it's been like to engage so intimately, so deeply with this medium wood for so long.
Well, I think those of us who have a passion, some people think it's an obsession, I think we're quite fortunate, although people around us may not feel that way. I mean, I was married twice, and as I've gotten older, I look back in those younger days when I wasn't thinking about the other person as much as I was thinking about what I wanted to do and so forth. And I don't know that creative people are good companions. The people who aren't necessarily creative, people want to spend a lot of time just sitting and talking and indulging in what I think is pretty trivial stuff. And if you're like a musician, poet, or whatnot, in order to, I won't say master, because I don't think anyone really masters anything much, but you keep trying to better your work, and that takes a great deal of time. And when you think all the other things like earning a living and taking care of children and buying groceries, that have to do, but I spent a great deal of time thinking about what I wanted to do and how to do it. And in my working days, when I had ordinary jobs, I spent so much time trying to find time, and because, as you know, in working days, time goes fast. But when my second marriage, I had 3 children with me, and I set up a very strict routine. My youngest son now tells people living with my father was like living with a drill sergeant. And we had routines, bedtime, food time, study time, and all this stuff. From 5 to 10, I would go to the studio, but on the weekends, I might put in 10 or 12 hours, because finding time to really work, because I know people that they weren't concerned with that very, very much. I shared a studio with an artist, and maybe she'd come in 2 or 3 times a week, and I never understood how you could produce at that rate.
Yeah, I mean, in preparation for this, I was thinking about it. For 40 years, you're working this job at the post office.
Yes.
While you're raising these kids, yes, and somehow carving out, pun intended, time for your sculpture making.
Yes.
You must have become an expert in time management.
Well, I had to do a lot of that. Unfortunately, as the children got older, teenagers and stuff, but I still had to be there, I remember one time my son, he was about 17, he wanted to have a party. And I said, well, I don't know, I got to do such and such a thing. He said, oh, we can do the party without you. I said, oh, no. Hey, you won't do a party without me. I got to be here.
I thought we'd also highlight that you spent so much time in this same place, Pittsburgh.
Yes.
And there's this very strong connection between you and the city. How do you think about your Pittsburgh time?
Well, I know a lot of people really don't like Pittsburgh. I'm not saying I'm enamored with it, but for most times it was the best city for me. And also, like I point out, that I grew. One reason why I took the wood, it was ready available. There was a lot of parks, and I knew the manager of the park where they took down trees and stored them, and I could go and pick any material I want. And artists, particularly who don't have a lot of money, one of their problems is paying for material, whether it's paint, whether it's other materials, canvas, and so. But I had this ready material, and then also sometimes I was lucky enough to find something was already made by nature, but the main thing, and also the rent in Pittsburgh is considerably less than, say, New York or Philadelphia. I have a fair amount of space that I work in, and it's maybe runs about $500-$600 a month, depending on utilities. And I could not nearly come up with that type of space in a large city. So, and another thing, Pittsburgh's not New York; it's abbreviated New York. But also, getting my children through school, which is my main focus, I could do it easier in Pittsburgh than I could have done hardly any place else. But also, fortunately, I had early on, in the late 50s, I had a few people in position of power, or at least director of the Carnegie Museum. He took an interest in my work. And when you have someone who has a directorship, or they can see that you can have a show. I had my first show at the Carnegie in 66, somewhere around that, 1966. And for a rather new artist, that was amazing and very fortunate. And that led to other things. Well, another thing about Pittsburgh, they've always generated lots and lots of talent, I guess, with eyes toward New York City. So there was always a lot of great talent around, particularly music and dance and so forth. So you could always enjoy that at a price that, particularly where I lived in the Hill, you could go to the Grill and hear all the great jazz musicians and so forth. And whereas people that live in New York, particularly if they lived in Queens, the Bronx, I'm not going down the Village to hear someone play. I don't have the money or the time.
You mentioned Carnegie, which I did want to bring up. The show, remarkably, was within really your first 20 years of working as an artist or practicing as an artist. And what was your response when you heard the news that they wanted to have a show of your work? Do you remember that at all? And I mean, it's also, we're saying this is a museum, not just any museum, this is the Carnegie, where you went to the Carnegie International and discovered all these artists, Arp, Calder, Soulages, Pollock, de Kooning.
Yeah. I was very excited because I had very little experience. I did not know what doing a museum show or any single show felt like. And I had a year and a half to do the show, which in my mind was a long time. But within a year, I only had about 6 pieces made. And then I began to panic because I only had 6 more months to make about 6 more sculptures to make a show. And when you're a novice, you have no idea what it means to put up a gallery show, a museum show. Most people, they do 2 or 3 paintings and show them somewhere, but not realizing the amount of work you have to produce, because some things are going to be rejected. They won't make the show, won't enhance the quality of the show. So none of that stuff I understood. But as I kept at it and kept looking, of course, I credit the Carnegie as being pretty much my university. And because back in those days, the Carnegie was free. You could go in any time. And early on, when I went in the post office, and also before that, I used to work as a darkroom technician when they had black and white film and enlargers and all that stuff, which is pretty archaic now. I don't know if there's a darkroom anywhere, but I used to do that stuff. And the good part about it was that it was in Oakland near the Carnegie, and you could just walk in, and there's 4 or 5 others that were learning on our own, we would go in and try to see how things were done, and we would look at amazing painting. There was a large Whistler painting of a Spanish violinist, mostly in black, and we were very intrigued about the shades of black you could get in one color, and that sort of thing. So it was an education. And then, of course, when the internationals would come, I saw every international from the 50s on. And this gave us sort of an international window to what was happening in some parts of the world. So it was an educational haven for me, and it still is. A lot of times, if I think I'm slightly ahead of the game, I'll take off and go to the Carnegie just to see what's up.
Yeah, I mean, and in 1976, they acquired or purchased your work, Georgia Gate Number 1, which entered the permanent collection.
Yes.
Then remarkably, and I think this is maybe a pinnacle moment of the story, full circle, in 2018, you exhibited in the Carnegie International.
Yes. It's a failing, I think, of many museums that are more home-timey than, say, like the Met and the New York museums, that they don't show so many locals. And I remember, particularly after Leon Arcus left, he always had 4 or 5 regional artists in the International when he was director. But after he left, it was many, many years before they had any regional artists in the International. And, of course, that was a very big opportunity for me to do large sculptures in a big space. By that time, I had matured some and seen things a little more clearly. But well, it's always. I think it's always an honor. I think it's always. I maybe want to say luck or whatever. It's always an unusual opportunity to show in a museum space, because the amount of artists there are that are striving to get in those situations to be shown, like I've shown at the National Arts Center in Dallas, and I've shown some in the Whitney. It's just things I'd really never thought about when I was a younger artist, but I think that you're lucky. It's not about a matter of being so good, because there's a lot of great artists out there. So I think you're fortunate. I'm fortunate to have that opportunity.
Hey everyone, taking a quick break here to tell you a little bit about our Season 9 presenting sponsor, L'École, School of Jewelry Arts, which is supported by the Maison Van Cleef and our pals. In addition to courses, lectures, publications, and other programming, L'École also has a new podcast, Voice of Jewels, which draws on knowledge from its lecturers, researchers, and other experts to uncover the stories and secrets behind history's most fascinating jewels. The first 2 seasons, titled Sentimental Jewels and The Blue Diamond's 1001 Lives, are now available on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Upcoming seasons will explore the themes of gold, comics, talismans, and pearls. You can learn more about L'École and Voice of Jewels at www.l'ecolevancleefarpels.com. That's www.LECOLEVANCLEEFARPELS.com. And now, back to the episode. One of the things I wanted to bring up today is this great quote from Isamu Noguchi, because, and I thought I'd quote him on time. You have a big affinity. We have a shared affinity for Noguchi. And there's this great archival video of him. And he says, "Sometimes I think I'm a part of this world today. Sometimes I feel that maybe I belong in history or in prehistory, or that there is no such thing as time. But if you're caught in time or the immediate present time, then your choice is very limited. You can really only do certain things correctly belonging to that time. But if you want to escape that time constraint, then the whole world, not just the most industrialized world, the whole world is someplace you belong.
Well, I think people have different ideas of how they see themselves, say, on the planet. You can go to Noguchi's mile-high sculptures and see that he may have thought of himself as being a timeless object, or being able to, as people say, go back and forth in time. But I think that no one can really escape the space and time that they've come to. You might look at people like Ogan and went to Tahiti, or people that go up in the woods someplace. But, time will come after you. You cannot escape it. And I think we're all, if you want to say victim, but we're all property of the time we come up in, and that is reflected in our clothes, our tastes. I don't know many people who love things that weren't a part of their time, and then their education, particularly their education. You can look at when I went to school in junior high, we had music appreciation. And so we learned about the symphony, we learned about Bach, and we learned Beethoven. You had to be able to identify when they played the records at the end of the year who it was. You had to pass music appreciation. Now they think all that stuff's a waste of time. And I remember we had to memorize poetry, Shakespeare, the Mercy speech, and all that stuff, and from King Lear. And I'm talking about in high school. But my children didn't have to do that. And I don't think, unless you have been exposed to that type of education, because there are people who've never been exposed that somehow become fascinated by it. But I think is the reason for decline in what we think of as classical culture, and people appreciating a technical skill in music, art, or literature. I don't know how much of that is still prevalent.
Well, we hope it doesn't die. As I was preparing for this, I was thinking about time, and particularly the year you were born, 1926. And mainly because in 1927, just a year later, and this is still staying on the Noguchi thing a little bit, Noguchi worked under Brâncuși in Paris.
Yeah.
So you were alive then.
Yeah, barely.
But, decades later, the works by both of these artists came to inform so much of your thinking, incredibly. Could you speak about the time you've spent engaging with their work, Brâncuși's and Noguchi's? And
well, it might be, particularly Brâncuși. I have a accumulation. I never say a collection, because that means it's sort of studied and
intent
and engaged and knowledgeable. So I have accumulation of African tribal sculpture and whatnot. And early on, I think go back to my education at the University of Pittsburgh in 1948. I took a choice of a history class. I had like 3 minors, and one was history of world culture. And this was based on how one culture that was pretty different from another. And they used Brâncuși's idea of imitating some African tribal arts, and like the white Negroes and the princes. And a lot of them at that time were carved in wood. And I was remarking to someone that those Brâncușis you don't see much anymore. You see the burden space and the bronzes. I said, but it was the wood things that attracted me first to him. And then, of course, I was attracted to Noguchi because of Martha Graham, and not his sculptures at first, but the settings he did for like Appalachian Spring and that sort of stuff, the wooden structures and forms. And they had more of a intuitive approach than the formalized things that he did much later. And of course, me just starting out, that was on my level, so to speak. And I was always very much influenced by the ideas of Noguchi, of a Brâncuși, about time, like you was just saying. And because back in the day, I guess there still is that impulse. As new things come up, you should change your art. You shouldn't keep doing this and doing that. And of course, Brâncuși said, well, fashion changes every year. And I want to do something that when people come back 50 or 100 years, it will still look like an interesting piece of art. And that is one thing I've always strived for, is try to do something that's not only interesting today, but will be interesting in hopefully in 100 tomorrows.
Yeah, this idea of it's almost a relentless single-mindedness.
Well, I'm good at single-minded.
I know you once met Noguchi at a talk he gave in Pittsburgh, right?
Yeah, I met Noguchi twice. I met him when Martha Graham's from Pittsburgh, and she went to what used to be the Western Pennsylvania College for Women. They call it Chatham University now. And she wanted to do Appalachian Spring at her alma mater. And I had a friend that was a photographer for a TV station. He did all the stills. He said, oh, you want to see Noguchi? You can come help carry my equipment tonight. I'm setting up the practice for Appalachian Spring. And he said, you can't say anything, but you can meet him and so forth. Well, I didn't even get a chance to meet him. They were so busy setting up the sets. And of course, Martha Graham was ordering people to do this, do that. But then in the 80s, I guess it was very much in the 80s, late 70s, Leon Arcus, Director Carnegie, decided to have Noguchi and to give a talk to the Carnegie. And so they said, well, Mr. Noguchi has kindly said he would stay by the door and shake hands as people left the auditorium. So I told my wife, gee, that's going to be agonizing. Let's go out the side door so we won't be a party to this. So Leon and the treasurer, for President of Candid, they came running across the foyer. They said, oh, that Mr. Noguchi wants to meet you. And I said, what? He said, yeah, he's standing at the door. So I went back, and Noguchi said, you're a little guy like me. And he said, I really like your work, and I heard you mention my name. And I said, yes, I've been a big devotee of all the things you do, particularly the segmented pieces. I said, that what spurred me to my doing 4 and 5 elements, putting them together when he did the marble slabs and stuff. And people were looking, there's a big, long line all the way in the auditorium. I said, well, I'm really holding up the line. He said, oh, forget them. I want to talk to you. So we stood there and talked about maybe 6 or 7 minutes, and I guess people were wondering, who the hell is that guy? He's taking all this time talking to. So I thought he was remarkable in many, many ways. There's not very many artists that have the business sense, entrepreneurship that he had, and of course, I always feel that there are many people who really didn't get the recognition because of their race or where they came from or what they represented, but that in no way diminishes what the person has done,
Truly, truly. I mean, Noguchi also, similar to you, and many writers have noted this, had this sort of in-betweenness. There was a in-betweenness that I think lives in the person and the work. Could you talk about that, how you view this notion of in-betweenness in your own life and work?
Well, I don't know if I'm so much in between, but I think that, it was a situation that came up last year. They had 14 people were getting their MFAs from Carnegie Mellon. Dean of Sculpture decided to bring them over to my studio, asked if I would talk to them. And we were talking about what you do for your life and what you do for your art, sort of, as you say, in between us. And, of course, I said, well, I had children, and somehow they think that they're going to just be an artist. And I said, well, first thing, I never thought of myself having an art career as such. I thought art was something I did because I wanted to do. And so I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I just think that the thinking of art, or if you're a poet, you're always thinking of the sounds of words. See, the thing was, I was an English journalism major when and I wrote some stuff I passed off as poetry way back. But I think Noguchi would have been a hard man to understand, because I think he was so much into his work, his life, and I don't know if any partner or anybody could have dealt with that. I know I've been married twice, and I have a friend that's very accommodating, and we don't live together. And she has always sort of understood. Well, I don't know if she understood so much as just tolerated the fact that so much that I do is about
the work,
about the work, yeah. And it's very, very consuming.
Hey everyone, taking another quick break here to tell you about our weekly newsletter, where I share a behind-the-scenes look into each time-sensitive episode and also get into various things in the cultural sphere I'm paying attention to at the moment. You can sign up and join our 11,000 plus other subscribers by going to slowdown.media/newsletter. That's slowdown.media/newsletter. And now, back to the episode. So I want to take a moment to go back to your childhood in Newcastle, Pennsylvania. And I read that this time you spent with your dad there were times where you would see him literally come out of the mine.
Oh, yeah. My great-grandfather, my grandfather, and my father were coal miners. I'm the first male in my family, because my father only had the one son, but I'm the first one that never was a coal miner. And I guess you'd have to go back to people in Kentucky. My great-grandfather was born in Alabama, but my father and his brothers, they were born in Kentucky in the coal mines. It was almost like migrant work in the sense that when one mine went down, you moved to the next mine because there's only so much coal anywhere, you know. My three older sisters, they were born up in Elbon, Pennsylvania, near Cook's Forest. And me and my younger sister and I, we were born in Newcastle, Pennsylvania, but the mine was out near Grove City, number 5 mine. When I was a little kid, maybe about 3 years old, we moved out of Newcastle to number 5 mine because it was such a job, although it was like maybe 18 miles, such a job for my father to go back and forth to the mines every day. So we moved there. But I remember when I was a little kid, before I was, we didn't have kindergarten, you started first grade. So when I was 4 and 5, I'd run across the road and wait for my father to come up out of the mine. And even though I was only 4 or 5 years old, I would look down there, and I said, I may not have been a brilliant child, but I said, I never want to do this.
Well, it's wild how, if you think across time too, I imagine, it's understood, at least in some of your studios, you were in the basement.
I'm in the basement now.
So were your kids peering down into the basement at Dad the Sculptor?
Well, you know, I also worked in my own basement for a while.
You're still going underground. It's a family tradition.
Underground. And I think maybe, you know, it might be sort of ironic, but I think maybe it's underground work, what I'm doing. You know?
I also learned in researching for this that your father became a union organizer.
Oh, yeah.
And these efforts were not very much appreciated by the company.
Well, you know, they owned the mines and they owned the houses that we lived in, and they owned the company store. And so when John L. Lewis, who my father sort of worshipped as the head of the United Mine Workers, my dad was a big guy. I'm a miniature of him. He was a big, strong guy. So they started a unions, and there's one road came down, no houses on this side, and the mine houses on the right-hand side. So they would come down and they'd shoot at our house, whoever the company would hire. And my older sister, my mother and father would go to bed early, like 3 or 4 in the afternoon, as soon as he got off from work, then get up, because they'd come around at dusk. And
sounds terrifying.
Of course, there was no lights down this country road. But my older sister, I had a sister 6 years older than me, she would watch downstairs. My father would take the front window, and my mother would take the back window with shotguns. But my older sister, I guess she didn't hear the cars soon enough, or maybe they had the motors off, but they shot, and she looked until she died. She had buckshot marks in her forehead. Just lucky, you know, they shoot a couple inches later, she would have been blind, you know. But I remember my dad saying, I heard him holler. My mother was named Helen. He said, Helen, I heard him holler, they won't be back tonight. So he had shot someone. And of course, out there, they usually had one sheriff for about the 20 surrounding miles from Grove City all the way up to Mercer. But they finally did get the United Mine Workers. And, of course, U.S. Steel and Canadian, well, you know, as you know, the labor history in Pittsburgh, the Homestead strike and stuff. And because they had the money and the power, they could get away with shooting resistors and dissenters, particularly organizers.
I also read your dad was a moonshine distributor.
Oh, yeah. Well, that was our means of wealth. We were able to have a car and so forth, and my mother was able to entertain clubs, go to church in Newcastle. But the man that was the manager of the company store, like I said, everything was owned by the company, U.S. Steel. And we remember the cans were green and yellow labels with ESCO, U.S. Steel Company. But the guy who ran the company store was an Italian guy named Patrone. He worked for the mafia. And they distributed the moonshine to Mercer County and all around there. And my dad rode shotgun with him. So, yeah, I remember they'd come and search. We had a creek that ran through the back of the yard, but my dad would hide the moonshine in the pig pen or farther down the creek. It was a strange container. It looked like it was wood with a metal cone came to the top. And I guess they oiled about 5 gallons of moonshine, but we never wanted for anything in that sense.
Oh, such an upbringing. And you go on to serve in World War II.
Yeah,
in the
I was
Navy.
up here, in fact. For a while, I was at the Naval Aviation out in Jamaica.
Oh.
Yeah, for a little bit, yeah.
And eventually you moved to Pittsburgh, where, as you mentioned, you studied English and journalism at the University of Pittsburgh. You had wanted to become a writer and eventually were hired as a sports reporter.
Yeah.
Freelance for some magazines like Ebony, Sepia, and Jet. Tell me about this writing life before becoming an artist. What were some of the strongest memories you have from that time?
Well, I worked mainly for the Pittsburgh Courier, but I also did some freelance writing. Like I wrote the first story on George Benson for Sepia magazine in 1954.
Little child guitar prodigy.
Yeah. He used to play right on the streets not far from where he lived back then. But I worked for the Courier, and I had a byline. I wrote a column called From the Sidelines, and I still have some of the clippings, but when I was working, I never thought about saving the clippings. My wife said, you should save some of those articles and stuff that you write. So she bought a scrapbook and started saving them. But I think the most important thing was in the early 50s, after Jackie Robinson had broken the color line, as they say, so many people came through Pittsburgh. The Y was across, Center Avenue Y was across the street, and a lot of boxers would go there and train, like Ezra Charles and all like that. And then the football players would come in going to camp. I remember meeting Larry Doby when he was going to Cleveland. He was the quietest guy I ever met, and one of the quietest guys, including Coltrane. But I'd meet all the athletes coming through and all the fighters coming through, like Sugar Ray Robinson and all those guys. It was at that time, the Courier was the paper, and it had a great circulation. So I got to be known as a sports writer. Back in those days, they didn't have videos on high school athletes. So a lot of schools would call and ask me about different high school athletes.
Oh, you're like a recruit.
Yeah, I was like a scout back then. And a funny thing was that even years later, a coach from a college called me and wanted to know, he had heard this one basketball player was back in town and asked if I knew him. I said, yeah, I know him. And he said, you think he'd like to come to our school? I said, well, he just flunked out of Las Vegas with a D- average. He said, I don't care. So that was the type of thing you got to see inside of what college athletics basically were. Well, we'll find a place for him as long as he can play.
Your interest in language also extended in 1955. You edited this book, Compositions in Black and White. It was a book of short stories, poetry, and essays by Black writers in Pittsburgh. I wanted to ask about this because it seems like you were almost like this ringleader of bringing all these voices together. What was that like?
I did a lot of that in the arts, and we formed a writers club. You know, like when I graduated there were 3 daily papers in Pittsburgh, but in the next 10 years there was only one, and there's still only one. Of course, Dick Scape has the Tribune Review there, but no one hired African-American writers, or no one in any media as far as that was concerned. So we started this little club, and I knew I had a friend that was majoring in journalism at Duquesne and a couple from Pitt and so forth. So we decided, well, we would publish a little magazine on our own, you know, just not do it constantly, but just see what we could do to really think about what journalism and photojournalism was really about. So we got all the stories. I found the printer and I edited the magazine. And I think now, you know, in fact, even when I worked at the Courier, they'd always have me come in and do proofreading on the day of publishing, because I could really proofread. Now I don't know what a proofreading mark is. But it's just funny how your time changes when your interest moves.
Do you see a tie between this early interest in language and the sculptures you'd go on to make? I mean, I did notice that many of the titles of your works they have allusions to language and poetry. Repetitive reference, for example, or slanted message.
Well, you know, I still read a lot, mostly history and stuff like that, but I read a lot of poetry. A friend gave me a book by Chinese poetry by a translator named, I think, Red Pine. Talks about Li Po and all those, and trying to understand the rhythm of the Chinese poetry. Of course, I still have Dylan Thomas. I still have some of the records from Greenwich Village way back and so forth. And I think that the rhythm of language isn't so much different from the rhythm of music. And the rhythm of music, to me, is reflected in, I was explaining to someone on the gouge marks and some of the rhythmic pattern that directs your eye, sort of like you want to say a visual sound. I can't imagine a person who loved poetry that wouldn't love anything else but poetry, that wouldn't love the other arts. So I think that sort of a natural that I would have affinities, if you want to say, for. I think I was explaining someone they had something on August Wilson and they had me come up and give a little talk about me knowing him. And I said, well, I used to loan him Dylan Thomas records. And people had now, you know, have a clue who Dylan Thomas was. I said, well, we were all enthralled with Dylan Thomas because he had such a sound with language. I said, even if you didn't know what he was reading, his voice, he had such a rhythmic and intonation that I think I have this series of poetry where there's about 4 or 5 CDs with all these poets reading, from Alfred Lord Tennyson down to Sylvia Plath, Ted Hughes, and all these people. And I said, but when you listen to some of these people read, no one read like Dylan. And I said, it was just pure music. So I think that he might be the epitome of that idea. That's why I've been talking about.
Well, I loved your casual Coltrane mention. I mean, you've met Coltrane, you met Miles Davis, and we haven't even spoken about jazz yet, which to those who know you probably is a surprise. I mean, you listen to jazz as a daily practice.
Yeah.
You used to write about jazz early in your journalism years. And there's even a certain jazz to your work. I mean, some writers I've seen even call your work jazz. And these chisel marks, I mean, what you were talking about just now, I look at these chisel marks as almost measures of time. They're rhythmic. There's something similar to what you were just saying that comes alive in your work, I think.
Well, yeah, it was a funny thing. When I had a show in '97 at the Carnegie, the sculptor Richard Hunt bought a friend of his in a big collector to look at my work, and he said, "What type of machine does he use?" And Richard Hunt said, "What do you mean?" He said, "See, all those lines, they're so perfectly, and they're so repetitive, same shape over and over again." Richard said he doesn't use a machine. He calls it a chisel. He says, "I can't believe it." So it was much later when Richard told me that he thought I used a machine. I said, "No, I don't use a machine." And someone had given me one of those electric things, but also they make noise and they really vibrate, and you have to keep up with the RPMs rather than them keeping up with you.
Well, it makes me think about Noguchi, how he would talk about listening to stone. You're listening to wood.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think I tell students when I used to teach, you have to feel something about the material you're working. And one of the things that always interests me is, does the artist feel any connection with the material that he's working with? There's some people that work in all sorts of materials. I could not have that feeling for 4 or 5 different materials. I don't think I've done some things in stone, but mostly wood. And I like to see the person has a feeling for the stuff he's doing. I was looking at an old book of Bernard Leach's pottery, and I said, one thing, if nothing else, he had a subtle sense of clay. And where a lot of places there's just bottles or shapes of clay, but could be made of anything. And I get that from him just from my own view, and I'm not an expert on clay. I'm not an expert on anything for that matter. But he's one of the persons that I feel about it, the material.
There's one more thing I wanted to mention about your sculptures, which is that some of them have this sort of memorial or even elegiac quality, and some of them have been tributes to people such as Langston Hughes, County Cullen, Harriet Tubman, Sam Gilliam. Could you talk about these particular works, how you think about some of the sculptures you make as memorial or as tribute?
Well, I made the sculptures, like one earlier one I did, I attribute to Fannie Lou Hamer. I've done one that's in Carleton University on Dylan Thomas called The Long Leg Bait. And, of course, when we installed it, they had a student reading the poem Long Leg Bait, which is a very long poem. So in the middle, they decided to abbreviate some of the reading. But I think when I get finished with something, sometimes I feel, well, yeah, that makes me think of train, or I did a piece which someone's bought that crosses, and it's very aerial, and I call it Air Step for the Nicholas Brothers, because a lot of people don't have a clue who the Nicholas Brothers were, but they were tap dancers from Philadelphia in the 40s, and they made some movies, but they could really dance. So to me, I was talking to a group of Afro-American young artists, and they were talking about how all their work is based on racial identity or black feminism and all this stuff. And they're asking me, I said, well, my ideas are based on aesthetics. And then other things can trickle in, but the main thing I'm interested in, like Brâncuși, I want to do something that's not just appreciated today, but maybe people will come back 50 or 100 years and say, gee, that's an interesting sculpture. And it's not tied to a certain movement or anything.
I want to finish with one final question, which is that given all the terrain we've covered today, do you have any final thoughts on time, on the time you've lived or the time you have left, or a Thad time mantra, let's say?
Well, I think when you're alone, you're constantly thinking of termination, you might say. And, of course, I have wills and a trust and so forth. And so in the back of my mind, I'm always hoping I'll live long enough to finish the next show, you might say. And I've been very fortunate in the sense that I haven't had any disabilities. I can still walk. I can still stand. My one daughter used to be in respiratory therapy, and she said, I can't believe that you don't have any arm trouble, any back trouble, or anything. I said, oh, I've been fortunate there.
It's the carving.
I said, well, I never bought a crane till I was 82. So I was left to that stuff myself. I said, but you learn how to do things. There was a big guy that's a tree surgeon, and he's about 6'5", about 270, and he and I were getting harvest some trees that he had gotten. He was bringing to my studio, and they were like maybe a couple tons apiece, and 14 feet, 12 foot, and so big around. He says, you know, Mosley, you're moving these logs pretty slow. And I said, Joel, I want that log to move, and I move. So I learned how to do that. Yeah.
Well, Thaddeus, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thanks for asking me.
Extra thanks to our Season 9 presenting sponsor, L'École, School of Jewelry Arts, which is supported by the Maison Van Cleef and Arpels. A unique place for learning, L'École welcomes the general public to the world of jewelry through courses, talks, exhibitions, videos, books, and now, its Voice of Jewels podcast. You can find out more about L'École at www.l'ecolevancleefarpels.com. That's www.LECOLEVANCLEEFARPELS.com. And thank you for listening. You can find more episodes of Time Sensitive on our website, timesensitive.fm, or wherever you listen to podcasts. To keep up with our latest time-sensitive episodes and get behind-the-scenes updates, sign up for our newsletter at slowdown.media/newsletter. That's slowdown.media/newsletter. You can follow us on Instagram at slowdown.media. Our theme music was composed by Billy Martin. This episode was produced by Ramon Broza, Emily Jang, Mimi Hannon, Emily McDonald, and Johnny Simon.